Well, here we go again. This is part two of the death of hip, talking about the darker side of the hippie movement. There are a lot of things I didn't mention in part one, and I don't know how long it'll take for me to remember them. I didn't mention blacks, for instance. I had a lot to do with blacks. They were part of the interaction in the underground. And in fact, blacks and hippies got along pretty well. A lot of the hippie slang came from Gullah initially, and then through the black speech that we heard. And we were into jazz and blues and all that. I had the good fortune of being a guest in the San Diego ghetto. Through a happenstance, they were inviting hippies, and several of us went, and they put us up in a comfortable place. And the group that had invited us was very good about protecting us. And that goes, of course, from the authorities as well. I remember somebody telling me about being in a black ghetto, and oh no, we don't got no white folks here. And necessarily so, because one of the weirder experiences was when a bunch of us, a mixed group of black and white, were walking around San Diego. I forget what we were doing, but we managed to draw a couple of squad cars. And they checked everybody's ID and went through the usual rigmarole. And of course, we weren't bothering anybody, so they let us go. And then there's the other angle. I didn't have a playbook of who these characters are. You know, like that 12-year-old with the derby hat, like not being able to read the jukebox. A lot of unfamiliar, mostly good impressions. And those folks treated us really well. I had a friend named Champ. He washed windows, made a little extra cash. He was a heroin addict. I think he had recently kicked. And we hit it off. We became friends. And it makes me sad to think that his chances were so few. In fact, he later wrote to me from the San Diego jail, and I wrote him a card back. I hope he's all right. I feel that way about everybody that I've met. Anyway, the hippie movement was really eclectic in that sense. Another minority group, excuse us, but we were one, another minority group that was key in the hippie cultural milieu was the American Indians. Now, the Native Americans accepted a lot of hippies in their ranks. I don't know exactly how that went. I wasn't in that circle. Though I remember camping on Indian land in the Quinault Reservation with 6 other hippies. Full moon was out. It was beautiful. We were all pretty stoned. And they, of course, the Indians knew we were there, but didn't care. And in fact, some of us went into the town and bought a beautiful salmon, and we had a barbecue that night. However, this was just after Kanzi got deported over the Vietnam War. He was my professor in the university, and as a result, I left the university. I thought it was outrageous the way they treated him. Anyway, there was a lot of trouble in the air, and it was summer of 1968. I rode with a couple south, we were going to the Zen temple, the Chinese Zen temple in San Francisco. We had been there on a visit, those of us in the cluster that spoke Chinese, and been well welcomed. So we were all headed there. I hitched a ride with a couple that had been among the 7 of us, and that lasted only until mid-Oregon. I got off at Crater Lake, and that began the downward spiral. I walked into Klamath Falls and immediately got in various kinds of trouble. Starting with that camp out, I stopped understanding what was happening to me. It was very strange. In any case, I walked into the town. I had money. I bought a bus ticket, I think I did, to San Francisco, and had that on me. I slept in a field that night, came back into town, asked somebody if they had change for $1 because I saw a vending machine, and they went and called the cop. So I got arrested, and I was in jail for no particular reason, and I came up before kangaroo court, and there was the room was full of winos and bums, and I watched what was going on, and it was very routine. They'd plead guilty and time served, or case dismissed, whatever the rap was. So it went through 15 or 20 people not guilty, case dismissed. Came to me, and they all said guilty. And it came to me, and I said guilty. And he said 6 months. So I was not so familiar with jail at the time to think about what 6 months of doing time might entail. But I, of course, wasn't pleased at the outcome. And then one of the officers got me in a chokehold and threw me in a cell with a bunch of winos. And I had various interesting interactions in there. The people were pretty amazing, really. Characters, a lot of them. Anyway, they, well, this is a long-winded tale, but it's worth telling, so I'll continue without the sourdough expansion either. This is the actual truth as I remember it and as I experienced it. In any case, I was a nuisance, and they decided to let me go. So they, I don't know how that 6-month sentence went away, but they loaded me in a squad car and were taking me to the Greyhound station because among my property was a Greyhound ticket to San Francisco. And we got there, and the bus was just pulling out. And I said, damn, he missed his bus. So back in the cell. And then they must have confabbed a little bit and figure out what to do with this bozo. And finally, somebody came in to my cell and ended up driving me down to a bridge near the middle of town. And they said, well, there were 2 squad cars parked there. And they said, this one is going north, that one is going south. Which one do you want? You know, I was being run out of town, in other words. Okay. And I looked over the situation, and I said, no thanks, I'll take the train, and walked into the freight yard. Luckily, I had ridden the freight cars before, one time I think it was, so I had some idea what the hell I was doing. But from there, it got really strange. I did find a vending machine again. I had some coin, and I bought a bottle of Pepsi. I walked around a rail car, and there on the northbound train on a flat car was a guy sitting there, and he had a big jug of red wine and a carton of cigarettes, which is like perfect bait for the bum crowd. And I started to approach him, and then I saw something very evil in him. And he had a third eye, and he opened it, and there was a blast of heat. And I ran. I remember the feeling of the heat on my on the back of my hand as I rounded a gondola car. And this is what actually happened. And later I saw the northbound train started up, and there he was sitting on that flat car with his jug of wine and his carton of cigarettes. I don't know how he got anything lit in that wind, but away he went. And I got on the southbound train, found it, and there were no yard bulls about. I ended up riding on the coupling, and I'm not sure why I didn't get in a boxcar, but I was riding on the coupling, and I had the bottle of Pepsi but no opener. So I broke the bottle on the iron and managed to drink it. It had sharp shards, right? But I managed to drink it without cutting myself, right? So I assuaged my thirst. And I'm riding along then, it's building up speed, and away we go. It stopped north of Mount Shasta. It was probably going to Oakland, but I got off there where it stopped and crossed the highway. It was 2 lanes. I guess I-5 didn't exist at the time. We're talking 1968. I don't know, but that's the memory. Anyway, I saw a bus in the distance, disappearing in the distance again. I saw a motel that looked really sleazy. I walked across the highway, and there was a nice field with some forest on the other side. So I thought, okay. And there was a stream. So I'll follow the stream up, find a campsite. And I'd lost all my gear by that time, but it's still possible to camp. So I'm walking up the stream, I'm walking through the field, and along comes a cowboy on a horse. And he stops his horse, and he looks at me and says, "Nice day for fishing." And I kind of nod, or whatever I did. And then he rode off. And I kept following the stream uphill through the woods. And, of course, I was thirsty, so I drank from the stream. And I got about 2/3 the length of it up the hill, and there was the corpse of a deer in the water, covered with flies. I thought, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. And I followed it the rest of the way up, and there was a poison lake there that was the source of it. It had a rusty color, and it had some gnarly stuff in it. And at that point, I began to really lose it. Did find a place to sleep. It's up on a ridge away from the forest, and it was cold that night, and I remember thinking maybe I should start a fire. Bad idea, of course. And in my mind's eye, some Indian elders appeared. I don't know where they were from or who they were, but they advised me. And the first thing they said, of course, was no fire. And, of course, I assented and didn't use the matches I had. And it got colder and colder, and I'm shivering away. And for a while, I had the feeling I was connected with the galactic overbrain, which was a kind of a hallucination, the sum total of everybody's neural net, something like that. And then I saw light in the east, and I thought, finally, I can get warm. And it was moonrise. Oops. So I had a couple more hours to wait, but finally sunrise came, and I rethermalized my body. I think I had mild hypothermia, but it was lovely to stand in the sun and get warmed that way. Then I walked back into the forest. I don't remember what exactly I was doing, towards the Poison Lake, and I saw a flying saucer. At least that was my first impression. So I looked again through the trees, and oh no, it's not a flying saucer, it's a 27-dimensional pickup truck. Okay, and there's some cowboys loading this truck or unloading it. It looked like they were loading it. And I realized I didn't want to interact with those guys. So I started moving away from the truck quietly. Somehow they knew I was there. I know they didn't see me, but they knew I was there, and it got harder and harder to get around the tree trunks, and I ended up losing all my clothes, which was a pretty strange event, but that's what happened. So here I am, naked in the wilderness. It's not exactly a wilderness; it might as well be. And of course, you have to walk very carefully when you're in that kind of situation because of the feet. But I basically walked. I found a road, and I walked along the road. It had a couple farms on it, and I got to the highway or main road, and I was taking a bath in a drainage ditch. When along comes the sheriff, and he stuffs me in a raincoat that's 5 sizes too big, and away we go. And of course, I'm right in the psych ward in no time. And they asked me about the Empire Club, and of course I knew nothing of it. And so I asked them, "What's that?" And all they said was, "Well, you've been trespassing on their land." Fascisti is probably not accurate, but whoever they were, they certainly didn't like trespassers. Anyway, various things happened in that psych ward. A couple of notable ones. 2 guys in coveralls came into the cell with my food. And as they sat down the tray, I looked at them, and one of them was the dead ringer for the FBI contact in a 1950s television drama. I thought, oh, they must have used somebody retired or something. Anyway, just seeing that face and the expression on that face, I knew they were FBI. And I said, "Gentlemen," and they said, "We'll try to get you out," and left the cell. And of course, they later discovered I wasn't working for them either and didn't try to get me out. And in fact, I was sent down to Mendocino State Hospital. I think it was an involuntary commitment. I don't remember. And I languished in there. Well, languished isn't the word for it. I went through a bunch of stuff in there. The other thing that happened that was a glimmer of hope, down the row in another cell was a very loud woman named Vera Dow from Dunsmuir, another railroad town. And she was interesting. She was fun. And she was definitely yelling at the staff. And one time a nurse came into my cell, and we're talking, and she said she was doing 6. Ah, another outlaw, right? And by that she meant she was doing 6 months of community service, probably for a drug bust. So we got along famously, and I tried to convince her that she ought to get the keys and bust us out. And of course, that was totally absurd. And she said, "Well, if we do that, my ass is grass and the boss is the lawnmower." And so I took that as a definite no, and we proceeded to hang out when we could. She cheered me up quite a bit. Anyway, down to the state place and that whole rigmarole. And my friend that I was taken down with, Jimmy the Indian, was in there for opening and closing car doors. I didn't quite get that, but anyway, they had him in there, and he had his Bible with him, and he would pat his Bible and say, "This is my proof." And that was most of what he ever said. When we got to the state place, he was put in with the slobberers in the lower wards, which was, at the time I thought that's weird, but now I realize it was really institutional racism. Anyway, he kept coming up to my ward and visiting me. And finally, one of the nurses said, "You shouldn't have him visiting here. He's from over there." And I said, "He's my friend, and I want him to visit, and that's the end of it." And they backed down in that case, and Jimmy kept visiting. Another time, oh yeah, I had a friend that I called Ronar in my story. He was a junkie. He became a junkie from pharmaceuticals after a nasty car accident, I think it was. And when the prescriptions ran out, he started, buying morphine on the street. And he was in there. He had checked in, copping out on the nut, hoping to avoid jail time. So we happened to be roommates, and he knew his way around the block. He hit me to a lot of things. And it turned out that the security in that place was really lax. And there was a little store just down the road from the perimeter of the property. And again, Ronar knew the way out, so we avoided, I think, one patrol and proceeded to easy work to get out of there. And we bought a bottle of Tokay in the store and went down under the bridge and drank it. Tokay is really terrible street wine. I mean, it's very, very high alcohol content and no worse than bad Kool-Aid, I guess. Anyway, we got pretty drunk and had a very good time, and we laughed every time a car went over the bridge. Then we snuck back in. There was a temptation, of course, to keep going, but didn't make sense to do that, so we snuck back in. And I remember crawling under the nurse's station to get to my room because I was really drunk. I haven't had Tokay again since. Probably a good thing. But a drink and drug-a-log is a whole different segment. We'll skip that for the time being. But I do have to mention the LSD. I haven't mentioned that yet. Again, it was ground floor stuff. We were in a little circle taking fairly high doses of LSD, and at the time, it was clean LSD. It wasn't cut with anything. And of course, the best of it was from the Sandoz labs, that being where it was invented. But the street stuff was all clean. So we were very fortunate that way. On the other hand, LSD is a powerful drug, and it opens up vistas in multidimensional spaces, which we're maybe not so ready to experience. So it's a mixed bag. And it lasts a very long time. So we remember at the 11th hour, they were saying, "I'm so tired of all this profundity." It was a cosmic space. And I remember one time we were mostly using an attic in a rooming house nicknamed the Acid Trap. And one time the ceiling of the room turned into the keel of a ship, and everything was upside down, and it opened up into a picture of a galaxy. It was that's kind of what LSD does. And mostly when a hallucination is a hallucination, and it's dangerous if you don't. The other danger in it is that it gets you almost entirely out of your body. So not taking care of business. You know, people have jumped out of windows, all kinds of physical difficulties because of being too far out of the body. So there are dues to pay. I'm not going to go into too much detail at this point, other than to say my trips were very good at first. I had a couple of bum trips. The capper for me, the thing that started getting me out of the hippie movement, was an incident. I was in a basement. My brother was next door having a bad acid trip, and it was being nursemaided into sanity by some people. We had started a free clinic and were avoiding the system treatments for drug overdoses and bad trips. So this was part of that free clinic movement. In fact, my brother was patient zero. In any case, I was in another room, and of course I was exhausted, and I leaned back and I was kind of dozing, and I remember thinking about music, and an entity appeared in my mind's eye. It was very alien. I couldn't even tell if it was a mammal or a machine. And it was so innocent and open. And it looked at me and said, "Music? Like, what is that?" And I completely freaked out. How do I describe music to a being that has never heard of such a thing? And even though, as I say, that particular being was quite harmless, I did break the connection. And at that point I thought, okay, this is really too much. You know, that I'm way overextended, and so I produced the thought that I really wanted out of the whole business. And I eventually, of course, did get out. And again, the Buddha Dharma was very helpful in that regard, because I had a place to go once I left the world, rather than leave the world in some kind of grand hallucination. We had guidance, but it was rare, and it was mostly astral. You know, some higher beings had taken an interest in our antics, I think, and were trying to help us out. At least that was my impression. And other really good things happened, if strange. Like one time we're in a bathroom, there are probably 11 of us, it's pitch dark, and we've all got sticks of incense. And we're whirling the incense around in these circular and odd patterns. And the bathroom was full of this sparkling incandescence from the incense sticks. And other antics like that. You know, that was the good side. And the bad side, of course, is that the LSD apparently breaks down some of the myelin that insulates the nerves, so that you get a little bit of crosstalk between nerves that are usually insulated. And sometimes synapses burn out, and it takes a while to grow new synapses. So in a way, this death and rebirth that the LSD people were talking about is a matter of regrowing the synapses, because you become a slightly different person when you regrow your synapses. So it's not to be messed with, but that first LSD trip is a mind opener. It's like anybody that's a materialist should probably have one, just to understand that the world is a lot larger than ever you thought. You know, that for me was the takeaway message. But also for me, when you get the message, hang up the phone. That's my current view. So I don't need to further explore inner space using chemicals. I don't need to. I reserve the right to. And speaking of the right to, of course, LSD was made into a Schedule I drug. At the time we started, it wasn't known. And I remember getting word that there were some people to meet in a coffee house after hours, I think it was. And we went over there, and there were about 4 or 5 people with bald heads in black suits, slightly strange in some way, but very earnest. And they were members of the If that Tim Leary had founded. The If was the International Foundation for Internal Freedom, and demanding that the psychedelics be made into a sacrament, basically. And how organized they were and how many there were, I don't know, but we had an interesting interaction. That was one of my first interactions with occult people directly. I'd read some of the books, of course, but there's a certain intensity of concentration among people that are on that path that is recognizable, a certain seriousness. There was another drawback to LSD, and that's that the CIA was interested in it. I think their program was called MK Ultra, and they had been dosing people mostly unbeknownst, which is really not fair. Dosing people to see the reactions, thinking they might be able to use LSD in water supplies or something to psychologically disable the population. And, connect the dots. In fact, here was a group of people that were voluntarily dosing themselves quite a bit. Why not see what characteristics they have? So enter the world of CIA agents, whom we occasionally encountered, usually unbeknownst. It took a long time for me to smarten up that was going on. And, they made no bones about what they were doing. We're going to bust the revolution, one of them said. And there's a funny game that goes on. If you know you're talking to an agent, then it's best not to let on that you know that he's an agent, because otherwise you're in the game and you don't want to be in the game. We're civilians, right? We don't understand the rules of the game. We don't want to be in it. Nevertheless, they proceeded to get on our case in various ways. And again, I don't understand the interactions, but sometimes they were very helpful. Like I received a medical hint from one of them. I went into a cafe and sat next to a fella who turned out to be an agent, and he started talking in this long rap about spiral staircases and such things. And then he started in drawing information from me. I'm not sure exactly what the technique was, but he picked up on the fact that I knew a fair amount about nuclear physics, because I'd studied it in school. And I understood something of nuclear reactors. And then I told him, well, I was in an engineering library recently. That's how I became learned. I'd hang out in libraries. And on the new bookshelf, I began to scan it. There were all kinds of things from the NRC, all kinds of interesting science books about various phases of reactors. But there was not one about dealing with radioactive waste. Not one. So I told him that that's what I'd seen. And he looked at me and he said, "That's what we don't want people to know." Okay, so clearly we had to watch our step as this weird game progressed. And it got actually very, very rococo, off the wall. Like one time when I was at a Ram Dass a spiritual gathering after he returned from India with the transmission from Neem Karoli Baba. Ram Dass was holding a 1 month spiritual work camp at Lama Foundation, and I was on staff there, so I was able to participate. There was plenty of marijuana there for some reason, Shiva Prasad, he said, as he dumped a whole bunch of marijuana in my palm, and I got very popular for a while. At the time, I wasn't smoking at all, so I just became the distributor of the Shiva offering, right? Anyway, Ram Dass had 10-minute interviews, and I signed up for them. Okay, footnote. I had met a pretty strange fella who gave out that he had been a field agent in Cambodia or Laos. We became partners or friends or something. And he took me around and showed me stuff. Like we went down to the Rio Grande River, and there was at the time a anthroposophy house. And the woman needed some construction help or something with the roof. So we got up on the roof and fixed whatever it was. And other interesting interactions. One of the ones I won't tell. I'll tell the next one, though. When it came time for interviews, I went up the hill and had an interesting interaction with Ram Dass. He showed me how to breathe through chakras. And when my agent friend went up for his interview, I asked him how it was. And he said, oh, I interrogated him for 10 minutes. And I thought, what a waste of a spiritual opportunity, right? Okay, that other story. I'm sitting in the smoking area with this dangerous friend. And there are 5 or 6 other people on the benches. And there's an older lady who looked like an agent as well. She was the one that requested the group photo, right? And she was very adept with her camera. And there were a lot of freaks that came into Ram Dass's camp, so they had ample room for lots of film. Anyway, she was sitting there across from us, and there were at least 5 people there. And she told my friend, I'm having trouble with infrared photographs, getting infrared images right. And he told her the make and model of a telescope that you can mount on a camera. And I was jaw-dropped. And the 5 people around us heard nothing. I was the only one that heard that interaction. I was totally astounded. But anyway, you accept help where you can get it. And that, for me, was help personally. And I bet that was a plum assignment, right? These people don't carry guns, they carry flowers. And they like drugs. Big deal. But that's another bit for another day. To end it, I'll say, Tata Tata Ture Mama Ayu Punya Jnana Pushtim Kuru Svaha, which is an invocation to a female deity. On my shirt are a lot of ohms all over the place. And when we were in that camp under the full moon, we did some singing, I think. At one point somebody says, does anybody have a mantra to a feminine deity? And nobody could come up with it, with anything. You know, now I know dozens of them. But we chanted Om, which was sincere enough in its place. And now the Oms are all over the place. And Om on the range and all that, I think I've probably said enough. There may be other installments of this. I don't know. I have to review it. And if it's as crazy as it sounds, or what if it's all true, consider. Enough said. Thank you.